The largest storm to hit the city in over a decade didn't arrive with much warning. One moment the sky was a bruised shade of pewter, and the next, the wind was tearing through the oak trees lining Millbrook Avenue with a sound like a freight train running off its rails. Weather alerts screamed across every television and phone in the county. Schools released early. Businesses locked their doors. Gas stations ran out of fuel as people scrambled to fill their tanks and get home before the full fury of the storm descended on them. Highways clogged with the particular desperation of people who had waited too long, and the city, the same city that prided itself every morning on its efficient commerce and its relentless forward momentum, came to a complete and undignified stop in the space of about 2 hours. Traffic lights swayed on their cables over empty intersections. Gutters became rivers. Awnings tore loose from storefronts and pinwheeled down Main Street in the gusts. Somewhere, a transformer blew and took out power to 6 blocks of the financial district, which the morning edition would later describe as the storm's most symbolically appropriate act. And still, somewhere in the middle of all that chaos, one quiet act of kindness, the kind that costs nothing and changes everything, was already beginning to take shape on a flooded stretch of County Road 9. In the headlights of a man who almost didn't stop, Ethan Carter had spent the morning beneath the belly of a '72 Chevy pickup, elbow deep in a transmission rebuild, when his assistant knocked on the garage door frame and told him the radio was saying everyone needed to clear the roads within the hour. He wasn't the type to argue with weather. He wiped his hands on a rag that had long since given up any pretense of being clean, locked the workshop, and climbed into his own truck, a sensible, well-maintained Ford that he had driven for 8 years and intended to drive for 8 more. Ethan was that kind of man. He didn't chase things. He took what worked and held on to it. His shop, Carter Mechanical, sat on the edge of the Millbrook Industrial District, a modest operation with 3 bays and 4 loyal employees who had worked for him long enough to know his habits and respect them without being asked. The work was honest and the reputation was solid, built over nearly a decade on the principle that most of his life was also built on do good work, charge a fair price, and don't make promises you aren't prepared to keep. He lived alone in a clapboard house 12 minutes from the shop, in a part of town where the neighbors still waved from their driveways and nobody bothered locking their cars at night. Life there was unhurried. That was exactly how he had designed it, and exactly what he needed it to be, and he had not questioned that arrangement for a long time. He was 4 blocks from home when the rain hit in earnest, not the gradual kind that builds from a drizzle, but the sudden wall of water kind that drops visibility to near zero in 30 seconds flat. Ethan slowed to a crawl, his wipers thrashing uselessly against the torrent, and that was when he saw it in the cone of his headlights. A silver Mercedes pulled halfway onto the shoulder, with its hazard lights blinking orange against the gray curtain of rain. He almost kept going. The rational part of his brain, the part that had learned, through many years and many hard lessons, not to invite complications into a life he had carefully simplified, told him to drive past and let someone else handle it. But then his headlights swept across the figure standing beside the car. A woman, one hand pressed to the roof for balance against the gusting wind, the other holding a phone up toward the sky, as if she could physically drag a signal down from the atmosphere through sheer force of will. She was soaked completely through. Her blazer was plastered to her frame, her hair driven sideways by the gusts, and even from 50 feet away, Ethan could see that she had nowhere to go and no available means of getting there. He pulled over and cut the engine. He got out without an umbrella, he never owned one, and jogged over with one hand raised in what he hoped was an obvious gesture of harmlessness. She stepped back when she saw him, one hand dropping to the door handle of the Mercedes, and he noticed the calculation that ran across her face. Assessing him, measuring the risk, deciding in a fraction of a second whether this large, rain-soaked stranger was a threat she needed to manage, or a resource she could use. He'd seen that calculation before, on other faces, in other contexts. He waited and let it run its course without rushing it. "I'm not going to bother you," he said, pitching his voice over the wind, "but your car isn't going to start in this. The road is about to flood. And I live about 10 minutes from here. Dry house, working stove, and I'll leave you completely alone if that's what you want." She stared at him. He stood in the rain and let her decide. "I can call someone," she said finally. He pointed at her phone, then at the sky. She looked at her screen. Zero signal. The wind gusted hard enough to rock the Mercedes on its suspension. And a sheet of water came over the shoulder and ran across both their shoes. She looked at him once more, and whatever she found there was enough. "One night," she said. "Just until it passes." He nodded. "One night," he confirmed, and they drove through the worst of it without speaking, the radio flickering between weather updates and static, while the city dissolved behind them into sheets of dark water. His house was warm. He'd left the heat running that morning out of old habit, and the contrast when they stepped inside from the howling cold was immediate and physical, like crossing a threshold into a different season. She stood in the entryway and dripped on the hardwood floor with her arms crossed over her chest, her eyes moving across the room in the practiced way of someone who reads spaces quickly and extracts information from them. There were books everywhere. 2 full walls of shelves packed closely, stacks on the coffee table. A paperback wedged into the gap beside the armchair. A half-finished chess puzzle occupied a corner desk. A framed photograph hung near the bookcase, a candid shot of a mountain lake taken from low to the ground. The water perfectly still, and the light flat and silver, as if the photographer had been sitting right at the water's edge in no hurry at all. She was looking at that photograph when she went still, her gaze catching on something in it that she didn't name. Ethan had already gone to the linen closet and come back with a towel and a dry flannel shirt that was 2 sizes too large. He draped them over the arm of the couch without comment and went directly to the kitchen. And for just a moment, standing alone in the quiet living room of a stranger's house, with the storm hammering at the windows, something in the rigid architecture of her posture softened by a single, almost imperceptible degree. He made pasta. It was nothing elaborate rigatoni, with a jarred sauce improved by garlic, dried oregano, and a splash of red wine vinegar that had been sitting in the cabinet for months, but it was hot and substantial, and he put it on the table without fanfare or any of the slightly theatrical hospitality that people tend to deploy when they want to make an impression. She had changed into the flannel shirt and wrapped the towel around her hair, and when she sat down across from him she looked, for the first time that evening, like something other than a woman still managing a crisis. She told him her name was Olivia, just Olivia, no last name offered, and none asked for. He told her his name and she repeated it once, carefully, the way someone does when they're filing a piece of information they expect to need. He found a half-decent bottle of red wine at the back of the pantry and set it between them without ceremony. She reached for it before he did. They talked while the wind threw branches against the glass and the lights flickered twice. And through all of it he was easy, and she was controlled, not cold, but precise, the way people are when they have spent a long time learning to show exactly as much as they intend to show, and not one fraction more. She was composed in the manner of someone who had built that composure deliberately, over time, because the alternative had cost her something. In most rooms that Olivia entered, she could feel the precise moment of recognition land. The slight correction in a person's posture. The new brightness behind their eyes. The slight reshuffling of how they intended to behave around her. She was, by any measure that the business press cared to apply, one of the most visible executives in the region. Her face had appeared on the cover of 2 major financial publications in the past 18 months alone. She sat on 3 boards, was constantly courted for keynote engagements, and had learned years ago to treat every word she said in public as something that would be clipped, analyzed, and recirculated. She had become genuinely skilled at reading rooms before she entered them, at knowing which handshakes would cost her and which would buy her something, at maintaining the precise degree of warmth that communicated approachability without inviting presumption. It was a form of constant work that she had done for so long that she no longer experienced it as work. Here, in this man's kitchen, in an oversized flannel shirt with a towel around her hair, she was simply a woman who had gotten caught in the rain. The anonymity of it felt almost dizzying after so many years of the opposite, like taking off a piece of equipment she had been wearing so long she had stopped noticing its weight. She found herself saying things she hadn't said out loud in a long time. The specific exhaustion of the job, the way trust felt like a resource she was constantly running low on, the particular loneliness of being surrounded by people who wanted something from you. She didn't give names or specifics, but she spoke honestly, not as a calculated choice, but as an involuntary response to something in how he was listening. He listened the way very few people had ever listened to her, without preparing his answer while she spoke, without steering the conversation toward himself, without the slight, greedy lean forward that she had long since learned to dread. Her phone buzzed. The signal had flickered back for a moment. She saw the notification and excused herself to take the call in the next room. Ethan cleared the plates and began washing up, and from the kitchen he could hear the tone of the conversation without catching the words, the register of controlled urgency, of someone managing damage from altitude. He turned off the faucet and stood still. The voice on the other end came through clearly enough. The entire board has been trying to reach you. The Hartwell acquisition. The minority shareholders are organizing, and Harrison won't wait past Monday. He heard her voice shift and steady in a single breath, switching registers the way an engine switches gears, smooth and total and immediate. She handled it in under 5 minutes. When she came back to the kitchen doorway, she was already watching his face to see what he had registered. He was drying a glass. He looked up, met her eyes evenly, and asked whether she wanted more wine. She stood in the doorway for a beat longer than was casual. Then she said yes, and came back to the table. The storm didn't break that night. It settled over the city with the patience of something that had nowhere else to be. And by midnight the roads were impassable, and the power had gone out twice. They ended up in the living room with candles burning on the coffee table and the gas fireplace going, still talking, the conversation having migrated gradually from careful to something looser and more honest. He told her about what he had come to think of as his philosophy of small, not because he had ever named it or articulated it formally, but because it came out naturally when she pressed him to explain the life he'd built here, the quiet neighborhood, the modest shop, the daily scale of things. He said he had learned, somewhat late, that the size of a thing and the value of a thing were not the same measurement, and often moved in opposing directions. She said she understood the concept intellectually but could not remember the last time she had lived it. The last morning she had woken without an agenda already running. He said that was probably why she was working at 11 at night, when the roads were flooded, and she couldn't go anywhere anyway. She laughed quickly, and without guard, the kind of laugh that surprises the person producing it, and he thought it was a very good sound, unperformed and real. Before she went to bed in the spare room, she passed the bookcase in the hallway, and the candlelight caught the edge of an old folder on the bottom shelf. Yellowed paper, a company name printed on the tab in the bold font of a decade ago. She stared at it for a moment longer than she should have. Then she went to her room, lay in the dark, and listened to the rain, and thought about why she recognized the name. She was up before him. The storm had softened overnight to a steady gray rain that showed no intention of stopping before noon, and the roads were still closed, which 3 different apps on her phone confirmed once the signal stabilized. She made coffee in his kitchen, navigating his cabinet arrangement with systematic patience, and sat at the table with her laptop open before 7. When he came downstairs, he stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her, and she looked back at him over her screen. He said, "Good morning." She said the coffee was in the pot. He sat down across from her with a book. They stayed like that for an hour, she working, he reading, the rain on the windows between them, and a silence that was, inexplicably, more comfortable than most conversations she had been in recently. She watched him between emails. He turned pages with the same quality of attention he'd given the conversation the night before. Complete and unperformed, without restlessness or the low-level performance of someone who knows they're being observed. When he spoke mid-morning, it was to ask a question about the Hartwell situation. Unprompted, just the name she'd mentioned in the call the night before, assembled with what he'd observed of her over the preceding 12 hours, into a question so precisely targeted that she put her laptop down. His question named the exact structural pressure point in the kind of acquisition dispute she was managing, with the specificity of someone who had not only studied such things academically, but had lived inside their mechanics long enough to develop instincts for where they fail. She asked him how he knew about that. He said he'd followed a similar situation years ago. She asked when. He said a while back. She asked where. He paused in a way that she clocked and filed. He said he'd worked in finance before the shop. She let it go, but she photographed the folder on the bookshelf that afternoon while he was in the garage, and sent the image to her executive assistant with 2 words. Find everything. The name on the folder was Meridian Capital. Marcus called her back in under 2 hours, and his voice had a tone she'd only heard from him a handful of times. The careful neutrality of someone who has just turned over a stone and found something significant under it, and still deciding how to present what he found. Ethan Carter had built Meridian Capital from a rented office in his early 30s, on a partial scholarship from a state university in Ohio, and what Marcus described as an almost uncanny ability to identify systemic undervaluation in markets that everyone else considered fully priced. By the time he was 38, the fund managed assets that most regional institutions never dreamed of overseeing. He had turned down acquisition offers from 3 major banks. He had been profiled in publications that Olivia herself had read during her MBA years as case studies in unconventional portfolio construction. And then on a Thursday morning a decade ago, with no prior announcement, no farewell letter to investors, no press statement of any kind, he had vanished from the public record, as completely as if he had stepped through a door that no one else could find. The fund was dissolved in an orderly manner. All assets were returned to investors in full, with interest. No lawsuits. No regulatory investigation. No scandal. He had simply stopped, and the absence of explanation had generated, over time, more speculation than any actual scandal would have, precisely because there was nothing to point at and nothing to argue about. Marcus said, the guy was worth 9 figures at his peak, and now he runs 3 bays and a parts account in Millbrook. She didn't answer. She was already looking at the closed door of the spare room, listening to the sound of him moving in the kitchen below. She did not confront him with it directly, not at first. She watched him instead, with the practiced attention of someone who had spent years learning to read people in the gap between what they said and how they moved when they said it. And what she saw was a man who had no residue. There was no sediment of former ego in how he occupied his current life. No trace performance of someone who had once been larger and had not quite stopped being aware of it. He was just a man in his kitchen, making soup from scratch because the power had been intermittent and he wanted something reliable on the stove. She thought about the people she managed and the people who managed against her, all of them carrying their ambitions and their grievances and their strategies visibly on their persons even when they thought they were being subtle. She thought about the specific kind of fullness that came from having built something significant and knowing it the weight of one's own accomplishment that most people set down only in sleep, if then. He had apparently set it down entirely and walked away from it at a speed that left no trail. She sat at his table and watched him stir the pot and found, to her own surprise, that she could not think of a single person she knew who had done the same thing and seemed lighter for it. She told him what Marcus had found, sitting at the table that evening with the soup between them and the rain still going outside. She didn't apologize for having looked. She was not the kind of person who apologized for gathering available information. The habit had kept her ahead in rooms where everyone was doing the same thing and pretending otherwise. He was quiet for a long time after she told him. Then he said it was old news. She asked why he'd left. He stood up, went to the stove, stirred the pot, came back and sat down, and said it plainly, that someone he had trusted, the co-founder of the fund, his closest friend through 20 years of work and genuine respect, had done something he could not recover from professionally or personally, and he had decided that the entire world in which that betrayal was possible was not a world he needed to remain inside. He said it without drama, in the register of a man describing something that had happened long enough ago that the acute pain had been replaced by a settled understanding. No performance of stoicism. No invitation for sympathy. Just the fact of it, stated plainly. Which was somehow more affecting than any dramatized version would have been. She thought about the board member who had sent her a handwritten note of support 3 weeks before she discovered he was talking to her competitors. She understood the specific anatomy of that particular wound. She understood it in a way she had not expected to understand anything about this man in this kitchen. The situation at her company was deteriorating faster than her public communications suggested. The Hartwell acquisition had exposed a structural gap in the company's capital accounts that her CFO had been managing with optimistic forward projections and selective disclosure for the better part of 4 months. The minority shareholders now organizing against her position were not doing so spontaneously. Someone inside the building had provided them with the information they needed to apply targeted pressure, and she had 3 possible suspects, and no way to be certain without evidence she didn't yet have. She laid the outline of it across the table for Ethan that evening, framed as a hypothetical, watching how his mind moved across it. He asked 3 questions. Each one identified a different structural weakness, with the precision of someone who understood these systems not just conceptually but mechanically, from the inside, who knew not just where the walls were, but exactly which load-bearing points, if removed, would bring everything else down. She answered each question fully, without the defensive hedging she habitually deployed with advisors. And by the time she finished, he had identified what her official advisory team had apparently spent 4 months failing to locate. The vulnerability was not in the acquisition structure itself. It was in the internal communication trail surrounding it in documents that, read together by a hostile party, made it appear that the executive team had known about the capital gap for months and had chosen to proceed with the acquisition regardless. He laid it out in plain language, no jargon, no softening, and she sat across from him in his kitchen with the soup cooling between them, and felt the specific, precise discomfort of being outthought by someone she'd already understood to be smart but had not fully prepared for. He pushed a legal pad across the table at some point after midnight, covered in his handwriting observations and structural recommendations, organized by priority, and framed in language precise enough to take directly into a boardroom. She read it while he washed the dishes. She read it again. It was more useful than anything she had received in 4 months of official consultancy, from people who charged substantially for the privilege. She left his house the following morning. He had gotten her car started before 9, a fuel pump diagnosis that had taken him approximately 40 seconds, with the legal pad on the passenger seat, and something she could not quite name but recognized as significant: the particular rarity of having been helped without any visible agenda attached to the helping. She drove back into the city in thin winter sunlight and thought, for most of the drive, about the complete absence of performance in how he had treated her for 17 hours, and about what it said about both of them that she found this so striking. She drove back into the city in thin winter sunlight and thought, for most of the drive, about the complete absence of performance in how he had treated her for 17 hours, and about what it said about both of them that she found this so striking. She thought about the specific grammar of how people behaved around her, the calibrated warmth, the careful language, the strategic positioning that underlay even the most casual interactions, because everyone who spent time with her understood, consciously or not, that she was a resource, and proximity to her was a resource, and both of those things had value that people liked to accumulate. She had not been around anyone who was indifferent to that calculus in a very long time. She was not certain, driving back through the clearing weather, what to do with the fact that she had now found one. She implemented his recommendations in pieces over the following 2 weeks, and the results were immediate and measurable. The capital exposure was corrected. The paper trail was supplemented with documentation that reframed the narrative. The minority shareholders, finding the leverage they'd been counting on had evaporated, went quiet in the particular silence of people regrouping. Her CFO's expression in the next board briefing told her what his reports had not, and across the table, Harrison Merrill and Dana Croft received the news of stabilization, with expressions she had learned to read over 15 years in boardrooms, not the open relief of people who had been worried about an outcome, but the compressed, careful expression of people who had been counting on a different one. She made note of both of them. She also called Ethan 3 times in the first 2 weeks after leaving his house, and each call lasted longer than the one before, and after the third she stopped pretending, even to herself, that the professional purpose was the primary reason. He told her, the third time, that he didn't want to be drawn back into any version of his former life. She said she understood that, and then she asked him a specific question about a hedge structure she was considering for the company's next capital round. and he spent 20 minutes walking her through exactly why it would work, and precisely under what conditions it would fail, and by the end of that call, they both understood that his disclaimer had been reflex rather than resolution. The work pulled at him in a way he had not felt in a long time, the specific pleasure of a complex system surrendering its logic, which was the thing he had missed most, and which he had been telling himself for years that he didn't miss at all. He drove to the city on a Tuesday for what he described to himself as a single document review. He stayed 4 hours. The following visit was not shorter, and somewhere in the accumulation of those visits, he stopped inventorying the reasons for them. He met Marcus on the third visit. The assistant received him with the careful neutrality of someone who had done considerable research and had chosen not to reference any of it, which Ethan noted and appreciated. He sat in a glass-walled conference room on the 34th floor and looked out at the city from an angle he hadn't occupied in years, and found it looked exactly as he remembered, the same density of ambition packed into the same vertical space, the same energy radiating off the grid of it, and found himself, to his own mild surprise, less hostile to it than he had expected to be. It was Olivia who was different. In her own context, on her own floors, she was an entirely different order of presence from the woman who had sat in flannel at his kitchen table and said things she hadn't said out loud in a long time. Here she was, exact and total, the full mass of what she had built radiating off her, as naturally as heat off a machine at operating temperature. He watched her run a briefing in the adjacent room through the glass, and understood, for the first time, the real scale of what she was managing, and found it, rather than diminishing what had happened between them, somehow deepening it, because she had brought none of this into his kitchen, had carried none of the weight of it visibly, had been for 17 hours in a storm, simply a person. The problem running beneath the surface of her company was larger than she had represented to him, and he suspected she had known this and had been waiting, with the patience of someone accustomed to vetting before trusting, to see how far his instincts would carry him without being directed. Harrison Merrill and Dana Croft were not simply ambitious board members pursuing their own advancement. They were operating in active coordination with an outside investor group that was positioning to trigger a specific technical covenant violation in the company's primary credit facility, a violation that, under the terms of the underlying agreement, would confer on the triggering parties the right to call for a formal leadership review. As attacks went, it was elegant. It required no public confrontation and produced no visible aggression. It used the company's own contractual structure as the mechanism of displacement and left the attacking parties in a position to appear, to any outside observer, merely to be acting within their rights. Ethan sat with the documents in the glass-walled conference room on the 34th floor and felt something arrive in his chest that he had not felt in 10 years. The cold, particular clarity of a man who has seen this exact play before, run from the other side, and knows every move and countermove that the choreography demands. He had been the target of this approach once. He had walked away rather than fight it. He looked out at the city below and considered whether he was going to do the same thing again. He thought about the 10 years since, and what he had built with them, and what he had not built, and whether the life he'd assembled in Millbrook was the full measure of what he was capable of, or whether it had always been a waiting room for something he hadn't been able to name. He thought about Olivia across the conference room table. The way she had taken his 3 questions and answered them without hedging, without redirecting, without any of the small evasions that smart people deploy when they're protecting their position. He thought about the specific rarity of that. He pushed back from the window. He told her what he'd found. She received it without surprise, which confirmed she'd already suspected the shape of it and had been waiting for the specifics. She asked him what he thought they should do. He said he needed to think. She said she needed to know before the end of the week. He stood at the conference room window for a long moment, looking at the city, and then he said, if they were going to do this, they were going to do it precisely and completely, with no improvisations and no shortcuts. And she was going to trust him to make calls that she might not like in the moment. She said, without a pause. Okay. He thought about that single syllable for a long time afterward, the flatness of it, the complete absence of negotiation or condition. He thought about how rarely he had encountered that quality of unconditional trust, and about the last time he had, and about what had come of it. He drove back to Millbrook that night and did not sleep. The work of exposing the conspiracy took 3 weeks and required the kind of methodical patience that Ethan had always done well, building a case the way he had once built investment theses, from first principles outward, each piece of evidence corroborating the next, until the whole structure was load-bearing from every angle and could not be dismantled by the removal of any single element. There was a specific discipline to it that he had forgotten he possessed, or perhaps had not forgotten so much as deliberately set aside, the way you might set aside a particular tool because you've decided the kind of work that requires it is no longer the work you want to do. He found, picking it back up, that it fit his hand as naturally as it always had. He worked with Marcus, who turned out to be more capable and more discreet than the first impression had suggested, and who asked no questions about Ethan's background or his methods, which Ethan found both professional and intelligent. He worked with an outside legal firm that Olivia trusted, and that had no existing relationship with any member of the board, or any entity adjacent to the opposition, a clean line of contact that the opposition could not have anticipated and could not now follow. And he worked with Olivia daily, in calls and documents, and one long night in the conference room with takeout containers on the table and the city brilliant and dark outside the glass, the two of them moving around each other with the easy efficiency of people who had, without scheduling it, become fluent in each other's working rhythms. She didn't perform confidence for him in those sessions. He didn't perform certainty for her. They disagreed twice about strategy, once about timing, once about the legal threshold for what constituted actionable evidence directly and without theater. And both times the disagreement produced a better answer than either of them had arrived with. It was the most functional working partnership either of them had experienced in years, and they were both aware of it, and neither said so, because some things are better left unspoken until the work is done. The board convened an emergency session on a Wednesday morning, Harrison Merrill had called it, ostensibly to address ongoing concerns about the company's capital position, the same capital position that had, in fact, been resolved the week before through a restructuring completed via a subsidiary entity that did not appear in any filing Merrill's group had access to, and that had been completed in deliberate silence for exactly this reason. The element of surprise, Ethan had argued, was not a luxury in this situation but a structural requirement. The moment the opposition learned their trigger had been neutralized, they would pivot to a secondary approach, and the secondary approach would be harder to anticipate because it would be reactive rather than planned. So the restructuring had been completed quietly, documented with complete precision, and held undisclosed until the specific morning when disclosure would do the most damage to the people who had been counting on its absence. He walked into the boardroom expecting to table a motion for a leadership review, and found Olivia already seated at the head of the table, with her legal representatives present, and a presentation loaded and ready. The 40 minutes that followed were, in the account of 3 independent board members present, the most precise corporate defense presentation any of them had witnessed, across 30 collective years of boardroom experience. She named names. She cited documents. She presented, in sequence, a record of communications between Merrill, Croft, and the outside investor group communications obtained through a process entirely within legal bounds, through a discovery channel that the opposing group had apparently never imagined anyone would think to look for. When she finished, the room held a silence that ran for long enough to feel deliberate. Merrill looked at the table. Croft looked at the door. Both resignations were on file before 5 o'clock. Ethan did not attend the press statement. He was 2 floors below in a secondary conference room with a video feed, available if needed, which was where he had arranged to be not from any false modesty about his role, but from the honest preference of a man who had come to help and did not need recognition as a condition of having done so. He had learned, years ago, that the people who needed to be seen helping were usually the ones least committed to the outcome. He watched the feed for long enough to confirm that it was going well, and then he turned it off and sat in the quiet room and looked at his hands on the table and thought that this was what it felt like to finish something and that it felt clean. He thought about the board meeting he had walked away from 10 years ago, the last day he had been in a room like this, on the wrong end of the decision, and recognized that this was not a reversal of that day, so much as a completion of something he hadn't known was incomplete. By early afternoon he was in his truck and headed back to Millbrook. He drove home, put the kettle on, and sat in his kitchen in the quiet of the house, and registered, with the specific neutrality of a man who has done something difficult and right, that he felt okay, not triumphant, not particularly relieved, just okay, the specific okay of completion, of a weight set down cleanly, in the right place. He thought about what came next. He thought about Olivia for a long time, and then he started quietly making plans to go. She found him 2 days later, on a Sunday morning, loading boxes into the bed of the truck. She pulled into the driveway in a smaller car, less immediately recognizable, and got out and stood with her hands in her coat pockets and watched him work. He put the box down. She said she had one question. He said okay. She asked why he always left. He stood in the morning light and looked at her and did not answer immediately. Because the answer deserved the time it took to say correctly, and she was the kind of person who would wait for the real answer without filling the silence with something easier. The Sunday light came through the bare trees at a low flat angle and sat on both of them without warmth, and a dog barked somewhere down the street, and then everything was quiet. And then he told her. He told her about the co-founder, a man named Robert Walsh, whom he had known for 22 years, who had been his roommate in college and his first investor, and his closest friend through the entire decade of Meridian's existence. He told her what Robert had done in the fund's 7th year, when the returns had made them both wealthy beyond any honest reckoning, not out of desperation or necessity, but out of a calculation so cold and so premeditated that discovering it had not felt like a betrayal so much as the revelation of a fundamental error in Ethan's understanding of what he had been building, and with whom he had been building it. He had discovered that Robert had been using a subsidiary structure to divert a portion of certain fees into accounts that benefited his personal investment vehicles, not illegal by a narrow technical reading but categorically dishonest and structured specifically to remain invisible to Ethan. He told her that the money had not been the wound. The wound was the understanding that had come with it. That the person he had trusted most completely had been conducting, in parallel with everything Ethan thought they were doing together, a separate and private version of the enterprise that served only one of them. He had spent 3 months deciding what to do about it. In the end, he had done the cleanest possible thing, dissolved the fund in full, returned every dollar to every investor, and walked away without public explanation. Because the public explanation would have required accusing Robert by name, and he had not been willing to do that, not from protection of Robert, who deserved none, but from a conviction that engaging in that kind of public warfare would require him to become someone he didn't want to be. So he had left. He said it without drama, in the tone of a man who had made peace with a decision he would never entirely stop reconsidering. He told her that he had not lost his wealth. The assets had been structured before the collapse, in ways Robert could not reach a precaution he had taken years before, out of habit, not suspicion, and which had turned out to be the only functional thing he had done in the entire period. He had spent the intervening years holding quiet positions in a dozen entities under arrangements that kept his name entirely out of the public record, and his life entirely outside the radius of the world that had hurt him. The net value of his holdings, as of the most recent quarter, exceeded what he could reasonably spend in 4 lifetimes. He said this in the tone of someone reading a footnote factual, without apparent need for her to receive it in any particular way, because it was not the point of what he was telling her, and he wanted that to be absolutely clear. She was quiet for a long time after he finished, which was the right response and which he had expected from her. Then she said, "So what made you come back?" He said, "You." She looked at him directly. He said it without softening it or dressing it in anything, not a declaration performed for effect, not a romantic construction, just the simple mechanical truth of the matter, stated in the same tone he had used to tell her everything else, that she was the first thing in a decade that had made him believe the world he had left still contained something worth returning for. Not the problem she had brought to his table, though the problem was real. Not the old pleasure of the work, though that was real too, just her specifically, and without qualification. The way she had stood in the rain and done the calculation and decided to trust him anyway. The way she had thanked him for soup and a dry shirt without making the gesture smaller or larger than it was. The way she had asked questions in the quiet of that first long evening and waited, genuinely, for honest answers and had not flinched or repositioned when those answers arrived in a form she might not have anticipated. She took her hands out of her coat pockets. She said that she was not easy, and she said it as plain information rather than apology, or warning that she worked too much and trusted too slowly, and was not naturally good at the thing he seemed to do without apparent effort, which was letting things be what they were, without trying to manage them into something safer. He said, "I know." She said, "I'm not saying it to discourage you. I'm saying it because I think you deserve to have the full picture before you decide." He considered that for a moment. He said, "I already have the full picture. I've been paying attention since the night you told me about your job in my kitchen, and forgot to perform anything." She laughed the same quick, unguarded laugh from the night of the storm, the one that had surprised both of them the first time it happened, and he thought it was one of the better sounds he knew, not because it was beautiful but because it was true. He left the boxes in the truck bed, because unloading them in that moment would have been too symmetrical, too clean, for two people who had earned their complications honestly over many years, and understood that the things worth having are not generally handed over at the first asking. But he went inside and put the kettle on. And she came in behind him. And the door closed on the Sunday morning. And the quiet of the house settled around both of them. Several months later, a major financial publication ran a piece that its editors described as the unexpected story of the year in the region's business landscape. The chief executive of one of the city's most resilient and recently embattled companies had been seen, repeatedly and without apparent concern for the coverage it was generating, alongside a man who had been one of the most notable disappearing acts in regional finance history. The piece was careful and well-researched, and got a surprising number of the factual elements right. It traced the origins of the Meridian Capital Fund and the shape of its dissolution. It named the Covenant conspiracy accurately in its broad outlines. It described Olivia's corporate defense with the kind of language that business journalism reaches for when it wants to convey that something was impressive without entirely knowing how to say why. What it could not get, what no piece of that kind could ever get. Constrained as such, pieces are by what can be sourced and attributed and assembled into a narrative with a legible shape, was the texture of the night that had started it all. The specific warmth of a kitchen, in a power outage, with candles burning on the coffee table and rain on every window, and nothing to prove in either direction. The sound of a conversation that both participants kept going past midnight, because neither of them had anywhere else they needed to be. And neither of them wanted to stop, and the simple fact of not wanting to stop felt like something worth not wasting. The way two people who had each, in their separate and hard-won ways, built thorough and functional defenses against exactly this kind of vulnerability had found themselves, in the space of one long storm-bound evening, setting those defenses down conversation by conversation, without either of them quite deciding to. The article would describe the relationship with the language available to financial journalism: a powerful pairing, complementary strengths, strategic and personal alignment. Those words were not wrong. They were just describing the surface of something much simpler and much harder than any of that, something that had begun, not with strategy or alignment or complementary capabilities, but with a man who did not need to stop choosing to stop anyway, in the rain, on a flooded road, because someone was standing there alone, and that was reason enough. It had begun with a towel set on the arm of a couch without ceremony, with pasta and a bottle of wine found at the back of a pantry, with a chess puzzle on a desk and a photo of a lake and two people who had both been running from the same thing for different reasons, sitting across a table from each other in a storm, learning slowly that the thing they had been running from looked different when you stopped running and turned around and faced it with someone next to you. And everything that had followed the trust rebuilt one honest exchange at a time. The conspiracy dismantled piece by careful piece, the walls that had come down not all at once but gradually, and without announcement, had grown from that single unremarkable moment of ordinary human decency. The choice. Not to drive past someone standing in the dark. Some choices are small, By every outward measure, a truck pulled to the shoulder, a door held open, a bowl of food set on a table without ceremony. But the ones that matter most are never really about the door, or the bowl, or the shoulder of the road. They are about the person who chose, in the specific moment when choosing cost nothing and changing course would have cost nothing either. To simply be the kind of person who stops. Ethan Carter had spent a decade becoming that kind of person, quietly, and without an audience. And it had taken a storm, the right storm, at the right moment to show him what that had been worth all along.